The desert stretched out like a punishment from God himself, endless and unforgiving, where the sun beat down with a fury that could make a man question every decision that brought him to this godforsaken place. Heat waves rose from the cracked earth, distorting the horizon into a shimmering mirage of false promises and broken dreams. This was the kind of land that swallowed men whole, that took their hopes and their futures and ground them down into dust that blew away on the scorching wind. In this wasteland rode a man who had long ago stopped counting his sins. His name was Jesse McCady, though that name carried weight in towns from Texas to California, weight that pressed down on his shoulders like iron chains. 32 years old, but with eyes that had seen 100 lifetimes of violence and regret. His face was weathered leather, carved by wind and sun, and the harsh realities of a life lived outside the law. A 3-day beard shadowed his jaw, and his hat, black as a preacher's Sunday coat, sat low over eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and troubled and haunted. Jesse's horse, a paint stallion named Redemption, though Jesse found the irony of that name almost too bitter to bear, moved at a steady pace beneath him. The animal's muscles rippled with each step, powerful and sure, even in this merciless heat. Sweat darkened the horse's coat, and foam flecked around the bit, but Redemption never faltered, never complained. There was a loyalty between man and beast that went beyond words, beyond reason. A bond forged through years of running, hiding, surviving. "Easy now, boy," Jesse murmured, his voice rough as sandpaper, raw from days without speaking to another human soul. "Just a few more miles to Copper Ridge. We'll find water there, find shade, find a moment's peace." But peace, Jesse knew in his bones, was not meant for men like him. The saddlebags behind him carried the weight of his latest sin, $3,000 taken from the Western Union office in Silver Creek, taken at gunpoint from a clerk who had trembled so badly he could barely open the safe. Jesse could still see the young man's face, pale as milk, eyes wide with terror, could still hear the way his voice had cracked when he'd begged. "Please, mister, please don't kill me. I got a wife. I got a baby girl." Jesse hadn't killed him. He never killed unless forced to it, unless his life depended on the pulling of a trigger. But that distinction, he knew, mattered little in the eyes of the law, mattered even less in the eyes of God, if such a being truly watched over this cruel world. The robbery had been necessary, or so he told himself in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep refused to come and the ghosts of his past gathered around his bedroll like unwelcome visitors. The money was for his sister Sarah, dying slowly in a sanitarium in Santa Fe, consumption eating away at her lungs with each passing day. The doctor said she had maybe 6 months, maybe less, and they required payment, always payment, cold hard cash for every moment they kept her breathing, for every medicine they poured down her throat. Sarah was all he had left of the good in his life, the only reminder that Jesse McCade had once been a different man. A man who'd worked honest days on his father's ranch, who'd courted pretty girls at church socials, who'd believed in things like justice and righteousness and the American dream. Before the war, before the violence, before everything had gone to hell, the sun climbed higher, a merciless eye watching his progress across the wasteland. Jesse pulled his canteen from his belt, shook it, heard the disheartening slosh of perhaps 2 mouthfuls remaining. He wet his lips, just enough to keep them from cracking further, and returned the canteen to his belt. Redemption would drink first when they reached water, always the horse first. Then Jesse would take what remained. It was then, as the heat reached its zenith, and the land shimmered with waves that made reality uncertain, that he saw it. At first, Jesse thought it was another mirage, another trick of the desert sun playing games with his desperate mind. But as Redemption carried him closer, the image solidified, became real and terrible and impossible to ignore. A wagon, overturned on its side, one wheel still spinning slowly in the hot wind. The team that had pulled it was gone, either run off or stolen, leaving only the traces still attached to the wagon's tongue. Supplies were scattered across the ground, flour sacks burst open and bleeding white into the red earth. Water barrels cracked and empty, their precious contents long since drunk by the thirsty soil. And beside the wagon, slumped against a rock, was a WOMAN. Jesse's hand went instinctively to the Colt at his hip, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for signs of ambush, for riders waiting in the rocks for any indication that this was a trap. The Dalton gang had used a woman as bait outside of Tucson 3 months back, had lured in a merchant with a heart too soft for his own good, and they'd found what was left of him 2 days later, stripped naked and left for the vultures. But the desert around him was empty, silent except for the whisper of wind across stone and the labored breathing of his horse. No tracks except those left by the wagon, no signs of recent passage, no glint of rifle barrels hidden among the boulders. Jesse urged redemption forward, his right hand never leaving his gun, his body tense and ready for violence if violence came calling. As he drew closer, he could see the woman more clearly, and what he saw made his jaw tighten with anger at the cruelty of this world. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with hair the color of autumn wheat, matted now with dust and sweat, falling loose from pins that had long since given up their duty. Her dress, once fine fabric, the kind a lady of quality would wear, was torn and stained, the hem ripped away, the bodice darkened with perspiration and dirt. Her face, even in its current state of distress, spoke of beauty, high cheekbones, and a delicate nose, lips that were cracked and bleeding from the sun. But it was her eyes, when they fluttered open at the sound of his approach, that struck him deepest. Blue as a mountain lake, but filled with such pain, such desperate hope, mixed with utter terror, that Jesse felt something crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a ghost of sound carried on the desert wind. "Please help me." Jesse dismounted slowly, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. Though he didn't know why he bothered, she was clearly in no condition to pose any danger. He approached her like he might approach a wounded animal, with caution and a sort of gentle respect for suffering. "Easy now, ma'am," he said softly, kneeling beside her in the dust. "Easy. I got you. You're safe now." A laugh bubbled from her cracked lips, a sound that held no humor, only bitter irony. "Safe? There's no such thing as safe, not for me. Not anymore." Up close, Jesse could see the extent of her injuries. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, likely broken when the wagon overturned. Blood had dried on her temple from a gash that needed stitching. Her lips were so chapped they bled at the corners, and her skin had taken on the grayish pallor of someone hovering at death's threshold, someone the desert had merely claimed as its own. "What happened here?" Jesse asked, already reaching for his canteen, knowing he had precious little water, but unable to let her suffer without offering what comfort he could. "Raiders," she managed, her eyes closing as if the memory itself caused physical pain. 3 days ago, maybe 4, I've lost track of time. They came out of nowhere, shot our driver, shot our guard. Took everything of value. They were going to take me too, but the wagon spooked, overturned, threw me clear. I think they believed I was dead. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to check." Jessie tilted the canteen to her lips, letting just a few precious drops fall onto her tongue. She drank with desperate hunger, and he had to pull the canteen away before she made herself sick. "The horses?" he asked. "Ran off, or they took them. I don't know. I couldn't move, couldn't chase them. My arm, the pain, it was too much." Jesse sat back on his heels, his mind racing through calculations of distance and danger, and the slim chances of survival. Copper Ridge was still 15 miles east, maybe more. In her condition, she'd never make it on foot, and redemption, already pushed hard for days, couldn't carry double that far in this heat. The smart thing, the SEFE thing, would be to give her what water remained, to point her toward Copper Ridge, to leave her some hardtack and jerky and wish her Godspeed. A man in Jesse's position couldn't afford complications, couldn't afford to be slowed down by responsibility to another human being. The law was surely on his trail, The posse from Silver Creek couldn't be more than 2 days behind. Maybe less if they rode hard and changed horses often. Helping her meant risking his own neck, meant possibly sacrificing his chance to get the money to Sarah, meant putting everything on the line for a stranger he had no reason to trust and every reason to abandon. But even as these thoughts ran through his mind, even as the cold logic of survival screamed at him to ride on, to leave her to whatever fate the desert had in store, Jesse found himself unable to do it. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah lying in that sanitarium bed, helpless and alone. Maybe it was the echo of his mother's voice from long ago, teaching him that a man's character was measured not by what he did when it was convenient, but by what he did when it cost him something. Maybe it was simply that he'd committed so many sins, had done so many things he could never take back, that here, finally, was a chance to do something right. "Can you ride?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to ask anyway. She opened her eyes, those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to hold entire oceans of sorrow and strength in equal measure. "I don't know. I can try. That's all any of us can do," Jesse said, and he meant it more than she could possibly know. He stood, his knees protesting the movement, his own body worn down by days of hard riding and harder living. He moved to the overturned wagon, searching through the scattered supplies for anything useful, anything that might help them survive the journey ahead. He found a blanket, sun-faded but serviceable, and a small medical kit that had somehow avoided the raiders' notice. Inside the kit, he found bandages, a needle and thread, and a small bottle of laudanum, likely meant for emergencies exactly like this one. Jesse returned to the woman, carrying his meager findings like precious treasure. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, reaching for her broken arm. "I need to set it, splint it best I can, you understand?" She nodded, and he saw her jaw clench with determination that belied her fragile appearance. "Do what you must." The process was brutal for both of them. Jesse had set broken bones before, had learned field medicine during the war when doctors were scarce and dying men were plentiful, but he'd never grown accustomed to the sound of bone grinding against bone, to the screams of pain that no amount of bravery could completely suppress. The woman, to her credit, bore it with remarkable courage, biting down on a piece of leather Jesse offered her screams muffled but her tears flowing freely down her dust-covered cheeks. When it was done, when her arm was splinted as well as he could manage with pieces of wood from the wagon and strips torn from his own shirt, Jesse offered her a careful dose of laudanum. She drank it gratefully, and within minutes, the drug began to dull the sharp edges of her agony, bringing a glassy quality to her eyes and a slight relaxation to her rigid posture. "What's your name?" Jesse asked, more to distract her than from genuine curiosity, though he found himself oddly interested in the answer. "Elizabeth," she murmured, her voice soft and dreamy from the laudanum. "Elizabeth, though my friends call me Lizzie. Or they did once, when I had friends, when I had a life that made sense. I'm Jesse," he said, though he considered using a false name, considered maintaining the walls he built between himself and the rest of humanity. But something about her, about this moment, about the strange intimacy of shared suffering, made him want to offer her this small piece of truth. Jessie McCade. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through them despite the drug-induced haze. The outlaw? Jessie McCade, wanted in 6 territories for robbery, and worse. Jesse felt his jaw tighten, felt the old shame rise up in his chest like bile. "That's what they say. You want me to leave you here, now that you know?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something, some answer to a question she hadn't yet formed. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone is running from something, Mr. McCade. Everyone has sins they carry. At least you're honest about yours." There was a story there. Jesse could sense it. Secrets buried beneath her proper lady's manners and expensive dress. But this wasn't the time for questions, wasn't the time for unraveling mysteries. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, 3 hours to cover as much ground as possible before the desert cold set in. "We need to move," Jesse said, standing and offering her his hand. "Can you stand?" With his help, Elizabeth managed to get to her feet, swaying dangerously, her good hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. She was taller than he'd expected, coming up to his shoulder, and even in her bedraggled state, she carried herself with a certain grace, a bearing that spoke of education and breeding and a life far removed from desert survival. Getting her onto Redemption was a slow and painful process, requiring Jesse to practically lift her into the saddle, his hands carefully placed to avoid causing further injury to her broken arm. She settled into the saddle with a small gasp of pain, her face going pale, and for a moment, Jesse thought she might faint, might slip right off the horse and back into the dust. But she held on, her good hand gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination, her jaw set in a line that reminded Jesse of soldiers he'd known, men who refused to break no matter what horrors they faced. Jesse swung up behind her, settling into place and reaching around her to take the reins. The position was intimate, necessarily so, her back pressed against his chest, his arms on either side of her. He could feel the rapid beating of her heart, could smell the dust and sweat, and underneath it all, a hint of lavender, some perfume that had somehow survived her ordeal. "Hold on to me," he instructed, his voice low and close to her ear. "If you feel yourself slipping, you tell me, understand?" "I understand," she whispered back, and he felt her lean into him, trusting him with her weight, with her life. Jesse urged Redemption forward, keeping the pace slow and steady, mindful of the horse's exhaustion and the woman's injuries. The paint stallion responded with the patience of a creature who understood suffering, who knew that sometimes the journey was more important than the speed with which it was undertaken. As they rode east toward Copper Ridge, toward whatever uncertain future awaited them there, Jesse found himself thinking about fate, about the strange way that life threw people together, about how one decision, one moment of compassion, could alter the entire course of a person's existence. He'd saved her life, or at least he'd tried to, though whether she would survive the night, whether they would both survive the sea morning, was still very much in doubt. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as the desert sun sank lower, and the shadows grew long across the wasteland, was that the woman in his arms carried secrets that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he understood about justice and law and the nature of right and wrong. Elizabeth, proper and refined Elizabeth, was not at all who she appeared to be. And when the truth finally came to light, it would force Jesse McCade to make a choice that would define not just his future, but the very essence of who he was as a man. The desert held its breath, waiting. The miles passed slowly, each one measured in Redemption's labored breaths, and the gradual darkening of the sky from copper to violet to deep indigo. The temperature dropped as the sun made its final bow below the horizon, the desert's daily transformation from frying pan to freezer well underway. Jesse felt Elizabeth shiver against him, her body trembling from cold and shock and the slow wearing away of the laudanum's protective numbness. "Not much further now," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. In the growing darkness, landmarks became uncertain, distances became treacherous. He was navigating by memory and instinct, by the position of the North Star now emerging in the eastern sky, by the feel of the land beneath Redemption's hooves. Elizabeth didn't respond, and Jesse worried she might be slipping into unconsciousness, might be losing the battle against injury and exposure. He adjusted his grip on the reins, pulling her more securely against his chest, lending her what warmth his body could provide. "Stay with me, Elizabeth," he said, his voice cutting through the desert silence. "I need you to stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me about yourself, about where you were headed when those raiders found you." A soft sound escaped her lips, something between a laugh and a sob. "Does it matter? That life is gone now." Everything I was. Everything I thought I'd be. It all ended when that wagon overturned. Nothing ends until we stop breathing, Jesse said, surprised by the conviction in his own words. I've learned that much at least. We're still here, still fighting. That means there's still a chance. Silence stretched between them for several heartbeats, filled only with the rhythmic sound of redemption's hooves on hard-packed earth and the distant cry of a night bird hunting in the darkness. Then Elizabeth spoke again, her voice stronger than before, as if his words had rekindled some ember of will within her. I was traveling to Sacramento, she said, to meet my intended. A marriage arranged by my father, a union of fortunes rather than hearts. His name is Cornelius van der Berk, a railroad magnate, old enough to be my grandfather but wealthy beyond measure. Jesse felt his jaw tighten with an old familiar anger, the kind that rose up whenever he encountered the casual cruelty with which the rich treated the less fortunate, the way they traded human lives like poker chips, with no thought for the suffering such transactions caused. You didn't want to marry him, Jesse said. It wasn't a question. What I wanted never mattered, Elizabeth replied, and he could hear the bitterness in her voice, sharp as broken glass. My father lost everything in bad investments, in foolish gambles on silver mines that never produced, in railroad schemes that collapsed. He owed debts to dangerous men who don't forgive or forget. Van der Berk offered to pay those debts, to restore my family's standing in society. All it would cost was May. The story was depressingly familiar. Jesse had heard variations of it a dozen times, had seen how the wealthy treated their children, especially their daughters, as commodities to be bought and sold, married off to the highest bidder with no more say in their fate than cattle being driven to market. So you ran, Jesse said. Elizabeth stiffened in his arms, and he felt her turn her head slightly, trying to see his face in the darkness. How did you know? The wagon, Jesse explained. No guards worth the name would let raiders take them that easily, unless they were in on it. No proper lady would be traveling with such light escort unless she didn't want to be found. You staged the whole thing, didn't you? Made it look like you were taken by raiders, hoped everyone would believe you were dead. A long silence followed, and Jesse wondered if he'd overstepped, if she would retreat back into that shell of polite distance that the wealthy wore like armor against the unpleasant realities of the world. But then she laughed, a real laugh this time, full of genuine amusement and something like relief. You're cleverer than you look, Mr. McCade, she said. Yes, I ran. I hired men who I thought I could trust, who promised to help me escape to Mexico, to a new life where Vanderberg's money couldn't reach me. But I was wrong about them. The moment we were far enough from civilization, they showed their true colors. They wanted my jewelry, wanted everything of value I'd brought with me. And they wanted other things too. Her voice broke on those last words, and Jesse felt a cold fury settle in his chest, the kind that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count, the kind that made him do dangerous things on behalf of people who probably didn't deserve his protection. Did they? He started to ask, then couldn't finish the question, couldn't force those words past his lips. No, Elizabeth said quickly. The wagon overturned before they could, before they got. The wheel hit a rock, the whole thing went sideways, and I was thrown clear. I must have hit my head because when I woke up, they were gone. Maybe they thought I was dead, or maybe they just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, I've been alone for 3 days, waiting to die until you came along. They rode in silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts, their own private reckonings with the choices that had brought them to this moment. Jesse found himself wondering about the strange parallelism of their situations. Two people running from lives they couldn't bear. Two people trying to escape the weight of expectations and obligations and the suffocating grip of a world that seemed determined to break them. It was near midnight when Jesse finally spotted the lights of Copper Ridge in the distance, a small cluster of yellow glows against the vast darkness of the desert night. Relief flooded through him, though he kept it carefully hidden, maintaining the stoic exterior that had served him so well over the years. "We're here," he said simply. "We made it." Elizabeth stirred in his arms, lifting her head to look at the distant lights. "What now?" she asked, and he could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the fear of what came next now that the immediate crisis of survival had passed. "Now we get you to a doctor," Jesse said. "Get that arm properly set, get you fed and rested. After that, well, after that you'll have decisions to make." "And you?" Elizabeth asked. "What decisions will you make, Jesse McCade?" It was a good question, one Jesse didn't have an answer for. Every instinct told him to drop her off with the town doctor, to resupply and ride on before anyone recognized him, before the law caught up with his trail. He had the money for Sarah, had accomplished what he'd set out to do. Staying here, lingering even one extra day, was foolishness of the highest order. But he found himself reluctant to leave her, this strange woman with secrets in her eyes and steel in her spine, who had survived would have broken lesser people. There was something about her that called to him, some recognition of a kindred spirit, another soul fighting against the cruel indifference of fate. "I haven't decided yet," he finally said, which was both truth and lie in equal measure. Copper Ridge, when they reached it, proved to be even smaller than Jesse had expected. Barely more than a wide spot in the road, with perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a main street. Most were dark at this late hour, honest folks long since retired to their beds. But the saloon still blazed with light, and music drifted from its doors, a piano playing something mournful and slow. Jesse guided Redemption to the building with the painted sign hang above its door. Dr. Amos Fletcher, physician and surgeon. The windows were dark, but Jesse dismounted and hammered on the door anyway, his fist making sharp cracks in the night silence that echoed down the empty street. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a light appeared in the upstairs window, and Jesse heard the irritated grumbling of a man roused from sleep. The door opened to reveal a man in his late 50s, thin as a rail, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a long nose and gray hair standing up in wild tufts around his head. "This better be an emergency," Dr. Fletcher said, his tone suggesting that his definition of emergency was quite narrow. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "It's an emergency," Jesse said simply, stepping aside so the doctor could see Elizabeth, still slumped in Redemption's saddle, barely conscious. "Broken arm, possible concussion, 3 days in the desert without proper water or shelter. She needs help, needs it now." The doctor's entire demeanor changed instantly, the irritation falling away to be replaced by professional concern. "Bring her inside, quickly now. I'll light the lamps." Getting Elizabeth off the horse and into the doctor's examination room proved more difficult than getting her on had been. Her body limp and uncooperative, her consciousness flickering like a candle in strong wind. But between Jesse and Dr. Fletcher, they managed it, laying her out on the examination table with as much gentleness as they could muster. "Wait outside," Dr. Fletcher instructed, already rolling up his sleeves and reaching for his medical bag. "I need to examine her properly, and that requires privacy." Jesse wanted to argue, wanted to stay close in case what? In case she needed him? In case the doctor proved less than trustworthy? He couldn't quite articulate the protective instinct that had risen up in him, couldn't explain why the thought of leaving her alone with a stranger, even a medical professional, caused such unease. But he recognized the doctor's tone, knew it brooked no argument. So Jesse nodded once and stepped out into the front room, settling himself into a worn chair by the window where he could watch the street and wait for news. Time moved strangely in that liminal space between night and morning. Jesse sat in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds from the examination room, the doctor's calm voice asking questions, Elizabeth's soft responses, the occasional cry of pain when the doctor did something that hurt, despite his best efforts to be gentle. Jesse's mind wandered, drifting through memories he usually kept carefully locked away. He thought of Sarah, wondered if she was sleeping peacefully tonight or if she was awake, coughing blood into a handkerchief, waiting for a brother who might never make it in time. He thought of his father, dead these 10 years, killed by men who'd wanted his land and hadn't cared what they had to do to get it. He thought of the war, of the things he'd done in uniform, things that still haunted his dreams and made him wake up sweating in the darkness. And he thought about the choice he'd made this afternoon, to save Elizabeth instead of riding on, to risk everything for a woman he didn't know and had no reason to help. Was it nobility that had driven him, or was it simply that he was tired? So tired of running, of being alone, of carrying his sins like stones in his pockets, weighing him down until he wondered if one day he might simply sink into the earth and never rise again. The examination room door opened, pulling Jesse from his dark reverie. Dr. Fletcher emerged. Wiping his hands on a cloth that bore dark stains, Jesse tried not to examine too closely. "She live," the doctor said without preamble. "The arm is set properly now, though she need to keep it immobilized for at least 6 weeks. The head injury isn't as bad as I feared, no skull fracture that I can detect. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished, but that can be remedied with rest and proper food. All in all, mister, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name?" "Smith," Jesse lied smoothly. "John Smith. I'm just a traveler who happened upon her. Thought the Christian thing to do was bring her to help." Dr. Fletcher's eyes, sharp behind his spectacles, suggested he didn't believe the name for a moment, but he was wise enough not to press the issue. "Well, Mr. Smith, your Christian charity likely saved that young woman's life." Another day in that desert, and she'd be measuring for a coffin. Relief washed through Jesse, deeper than he'd expected, more profound than made sense for a stranger he'd known for less than 12 hours. "Can I see her?" "Briefly," the doctor said. "I've given her a stronger dose of laudanum. She'll sleep through the night and most of tomorrow, which is exactly what she needs. But you can look in on her if you'd like." Jesse stood, his legs stiff from the long ride and the longer wait, and moved to the examination room door. Elizabeth lay on the table, now covered with a clean sheet, her broken arm properly splinted and bound, her face cleaned of dust and blood. In sleep, she looked younger, more vulnerable, the lines of worry and fear smoothed away to reveal the gentle beauty beneath. Jesse stood there for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. Then, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Sleep well, Elizabeth," he whispered. "You're safe now." Behind him, Dr. Fletcher cleared his throat softly. "There's a boarding house 2 doors down, Mrs. Patterson's place. She have a room for you, and her rates are fair. I suggest you get some rest yourself, Mr. Smith. You look like a man who's been riding hard for a long time." Jesse nodded, taking one last look at Elizabeth before turning away. "I'll pay you for her care," he said, reaching for the money in his saddlebags. Sarah's money, the $3,000 that was supposed to buy her a few more months of life. "We'll settle accounts in the morning," Dr. Fletcher said. "For now, just get some sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, I'm certain." The doctor, Jesse realized, was wiser than he'd given him credit for. As Jesse led Redemption toward the livery stable, the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. He was exhausted, body and soul, worn down to the very core of himself. But as he settled the horse into a stall with fresh water and hay, as he headed toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with his saddlebags over his shoulder, Jesse found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. It was a dangerous feeling, hope. It made you careless, made you believe things might work out when experience had taught you that they usually didn't. But as Jesse climbed the stairs to his rented room, as he finally lay down on a real bed for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hold on to that hope just a little longer. Tomorrow would come soon enough, with all its complications and dangers and impossible choices. But tonight, for just a few hours, Jesse McCade would rest. Morning came to Copper Ridge with the subtlety of a hammer strike. Bright sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of Jesse's rented room, and the sounds of a town waking to face another day. Voices drifted up from the street below, the clatter of wagons on hard-packed earth, the lowing of cattle being driven to the stockyards, the eternal rhythm of frontier life. Jesse woke with a start, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt that he'd placed on the nightstand beside his bed. His body tensed for violence before his mind had fully processed that he was safe, that the sounds were ordinary and posed no immediate threat. It took him several moments to remember where he was, to piece together the events of the previous day, to recall the woman he'd saved and the dangerous compassion that had driven him to help her. He rose from the bed, his body protesting with a chorus of aches and pains, muscles stiff from weeks of hard riding and yesterday's exertions. The small mirror above the washstand showed him his own reflection, and Jesse barely recognized the man staring back at him. When had he gotten so old, so worn? The face in the mirror belonged to someone who'd lived hard and expected to die harder, someone who carried the weight of too many regrets and not enough redemption. After washing away the trail dust with water from the pitcher on the stand, Jesse dressed carefully, checking his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned that survival often came down to the smallest details. The Colt was clean and loaded, the knife in his boot sharp enough to shave with, the Derringer tucked into his vest pocket ready for emergencies. He counted the money in his saddlebags, the $3,000 that should have been on its way to Santa Fe by now, should have been buying Sarah another month, another week, another day. Guilt gnawed at him, but Jesse pushed it aside. He'd get the money to her, but first he needed to make sure Elizabeth was properly cared for, needed to know she would survive what he'd started by saving her. The boarding house dining room was nearly empty when Jesse descended the stairs. Just an elderly couple eating breakfast in one corner, and Mrs. Patterson herself, a formidable woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, standing behind the serving counter. "Mr. Smith," she greeted him, her tone suggesting she was no more convinced by his alias than Dr. Fletcher had been. "You'll be wanting breakfast, I imagine. Eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead." "That sounds perfect, ma'am," Jesse said, settling himself at a table near the window where he could watch the street. Old habits died hard, and a man in his position couldn't afford to be surprised by unwelcome visitors. Mrs. Patterson brought him a plate piled high with food and a mug of coffee that did indeed look strong enough to strip paint. "Dr. Fletcher was by early this morning," she said conversationally, though Jesse sensed there was nothing casual about her words. "Said you brought in a young woman half dead from exposure. Says you saved her life." "I did what anyone would do," Jesse said, uncomfortable with the praise, with the implication that his actions had been somehow heroic rather than simply human decency. "That's where you're wrong," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Most men wouldn't have stopped. Most men would have ridden right past, would have told themselves it wasn't their problem, wasn't their concern. The fact that you didn't, well, that says something about your character, Mr. Smith, whoever you really are." She walked away before Jesse could respond, leaving him to contemplate her words while he ate. The food was excellent, better than anything he'd eaten in weeks, and Jesse found himself devouring it with an appetite he hadn't realized he possessed. When he was finished, he left payment on the table and headed out into the morning sunshine, making his way back to Dr. Fletcher's office. The doctor was in his front room, updating his ledgers, when Jesse entered. He looked up with a slight smile. "Ah, Mr. Smith, I was wondering when you'd appear. Your young lady is awake, though still quite weak. She's been asking for you." Something in Jesse's chest tightened at those words, at the phrase, "your young lady," as if by saving her, he'd somehow claimed ownership, taken on responsibility for her future. It was absurd, dangerous even, to let himself form any kind of attachment to Elizabeth, but he couldn't deny the quickening of his pulse at the news that she wanted to see him. "How is she?" Jesse asked. "Recovering," Dr. Fletcher said, "though it will be a slow process. She need rest, proper nutrition, and time for that arm to heal. I'd recommend at least 2 weeks before she attempts any kind of travel, and even then she'll need to be careful." 2 weeks. Jesse felt the trap closing around him, felt the walls of circumstance pressing in. 2 weeks was an eternity when you were wanted by the law, when posses were on your trail, when every day you stayed in one place increased the odds that someone would recognize you, would send a telegram to the nearest marshal, would collect the bounty that hung over your head like a death sentence. "I'll see her now, if that's all right," Jesse said, pushing aside his concerns for the moment. Dr. Fletcher nodded and gestured toward the examination room. "Go ahead, but don't tire her out. She needs rest more than conversation." Jesse entered the examination room to find Elizabeth sitting up in bed, propped against pillows, looking dramatically better than she had the night before. Color had returned to her cheeks, and though her arm was still heavily bandaged and splinted, her eyes were clear and focused, no longer clouded with pain and laudanum. "Jesse," she said when she saw him, and the warmth in her voice made something twist in his chest. "Dr. Fletcher told me everything you did, how you brought me here, how you saved my life. I don't know how to thank you." Jesse shook his head, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No thanks necessary. I did what needed doing. Most men wouldn't have," Elizabeth said, echoing Mrs. Patterson's earlier words. "Most men would have left me there to die. Why didn't you?" It was a question Jesse had been asking himself, a question he still didn't have a good answer for. How could he explain the complex mix of guilt and honor and desperate need to do something good that had driven his decision? How could he make her understand that saving her had been as much about saving himself as it had been about her? "Because I'm tired of being the kind of man who walks away," Jesse finally said, the words surprising him with their honesty. "I've done enough harm in this world. Maybe it was time to do something different." Elizabeth studied him with those intense blue eyes, and Jesse had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, could read all the secrets and sins he kept locked away. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "When Dr. Fletcher told me your real name, when I realized I was right about who you were, I thought you'd be different, harder, crueler." Jesse felt his jaw tighten. "How did he know my name?" "He recognized you," Elizabeth said. "There are wanted posters in the sheriff's office, your face on them. He saw you when you brought me in, put the pieces together. But he hasn't told anyone, hasn't raised an alarm. He said, and I quote, 'Any man who'd ride half a day through the desert to save a stranger deserves a chance to explain himself.'" Relief and dread warred within Jesse's chest, Dr. Fletcher knew, which meant the secret was out, which meant the clock was now ticking even faster on how long he could stay in Copper Ridge, before someone else made the connection, before the law came calling. "I should leave," Jesse said, already turning toward the door. "Before I bring trouble down on this town. Before people start asking questions I can't answer." "Wait," Elizabeth said urgently, and something in her voice made Jesse pause. "Please just wait. I need to tell you something. Need to explain, God. I don't even know how to say this." Jesse turned back to face her, saw the conflict playing across her features, saw her struggling with some internal battle. "What is it?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, her good hand clutching the sheet that covered her with white-knuckled intensity. "My name isn't Elizabeth. I mean, it is, but it's not the whole truth. My full name is Elizabeth Blackwood." The name hit Jesse like a physical blow, made his breath catch in his throat and his heart stutter in his chest. Blackwood. He knew that name. Everyone in the territories knew that name. Judge Marcus Blackwood, the hanging judge. The man who'd sent more outlaws to the gallows than any other justice in the western states. "Judge Blackwood's daughter," Jesse said, his voice flat and empty. "You're Judge Marcus Blackwood's daughter. Elizabeth, no. She would always be Elizabeth to him now, regardless of what else she was," nodded miserably. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner, should have been honest from the start, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd leave me there if you knew. Afraid you'd, I don't know, take revenge on me for everything my father has done." Jesse stood frozen, his mind reeling, trying to process this information, trying to reconcile the woman in the bed with the legacy of her father. Judge Marcus Blackwood, who'd sentenced Jesse's best friend to hang for a crime he didn't commit. who'd presided over a mockery of a trial that had lasted all of 30 minutes before declaring the verdict. Judge Marcus Blackwood, who'd made his reputation on being merciless toward outlaws, who believed that swift and brutal justice was the only language men like Jesse understood. And Jesse had saved his daughter. The irony was so profound it was almost funny, except Jesse didn't feel like laughing. He felt like he'd been played for a fool, like the universe was having a grand joke at his expense. "Does your father know you're alive?" Jesse asked, his voice still carefully neutral, showing none of the turmoil raging inside him. "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "The men I hired to help me escape, they were supposed to make it look like I'd been killed by bandits, supposed to send proof to my father so he'd stop searching. But everything went wrong, and now I don't know what he thinks. Don't know if he's mourning me or still looking for me, or if he even cares." The bitterness in those last words caught Jesse's attention. "You don't have a good relationship with your father." It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth answered anyway. "My father is a man who believes in one thing above all else, the law. Not justice, not mercy, not compassion. Just the law, cold and inflexible and absolute. He sentenced my brother to prison for a bar fight that went wrong. Sentenced him to 5 years in territorial prison, where he died of fever 6 months later. His own son, and he showed no more compassion than he would to any other criminal. After that, I knew I could never be what he wanted me to be, could never live the life he'd planned for me." Jesse sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed, his legs suddenly unsteady. "So you ran. You staged your own death and ran." "Yes," Elizabeth said simply. "And then you found me, and you saved me, and now I owe my life to an outlaw my father would see hanged without a second thought. The irony isn't lost on me, Jesse. Believe me, I understand how complicated this is." "Complicated," Jesse repeated, and this time he did laugh, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "That's one word for it." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of revelations hanging heavy in the air between them. Jesse's mind was working furiously, calculating odds and possibilities, trying to figure out what this meant for him, for Sarah, for the impossible situation he now found himself in. "I need to think," Jesse finally said, standing abruptly. "I need time to figure out what to do next." "Jesse, please," Elizabeth said, reaching out her good hand toward him. "Please don't leave. I know this changes things. I know it makes everything more difficult. But please, just give me a chance to explain everything." "There's nothing to explain," Jesse said, though he knew that wasn't true. Knew there were 100 questions he should be asking, 100 details he needed to understand. But his mind was too full, too overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she'd just told him. "You're Judge Blackwood's daughter. That tells me everything I need to know." He walked out before she could respond, before the tears he saw gathering in her eyes could break through, and due to his resolve, what nothing else had managed. He walked out of Dr. Fletcher's office and into the bright morning sunshine, walked without direction or purpose, just needing to move, needing to put distance between himself and the complications that Elizabeth Blackwood represented. Jesse found himself at the edge of town, staring out at the desert that stretched to the horizon, thinking about choices and consequences, and the strange cruelty of fate that had brought him to this moment. He'd saved her because he'd wanted to do something good, something right for once in his miserable life. But instead, he'd entangled himself with the daughter of the man who represented everything Jesse hated about the justice system. Everything that was wrong with a world that saw things in black and white with no room for the infinite shades of gray that actually existed. What was he supposed to do now? The smart thing, the SAFE thing, would be to take his money and ride out immediately, to leave Copper Ridge and Elizabeth Blackwood behind, to continue on to Santa Fe and Sarah and the life he'd been trying to save. She was recovering. She'd be fine without him. She could return to her father, or continue her escape, or do whatever else she wanted with her life. But even as these thoughts ran through his mind, Jesse knew he couldn't do it, knew he couldn't just abandon her any more than he'd been able to ride past her in the desert. Something had been set in motion. Some bond had been formed between them that he didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. "Damn it," Jesse said to the empty desert, to the uncaring sky, to whatever God might be listening. Damn it all to hell. Behind him he heard footsteps, turned to find Dr. Fletcher approaching, his medical bag in one hand and his expression grave. "She told you then," the doctor said, "about who her father is." "She told me," Jesse confirmed. "And now you're thinking about running," Dr. Fletcher said. "About leaving her here and disappearing before her father finds out she's alive, before this whole situation explodes in her face. Can you blame me?" Jesse asked, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. Dr. Fletcher was quiet for a moment, his eyes studying Jesse with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "No," he finally said, "I can't blame you. Any man in your position would be thinking the same thing. But I don't think you're going to run. I think you're better than that. You don't know me," Jesse said. "You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of." "Maybe not," Dr. Fletcher agreed. "But I know what I saw yesterday. I saw a man who rode half a day through a desert that could have killed him, carrying a woman who would have died without his help. I saw a man who paid for her medical care with money I suspect he desperately needs for himself. I saw a man who stayed by her bedside half the night even after I assured him she'd live. That tells me something about who you are, Jesse McCade, regardless of what the wanted posters might say." Jesse wanted to argue, wanted to tell the doctor he was wrong, that Jesse was exactly the kind of man who would run, who would put his own survival above everything else. But the words wouldn't come, because some part of him, some small part he'd thought long dead, knew that Dr. Fletcher was right. "What am I supposed to do?" Jesse asked, and he hated the note of desperation that crept into his voice, hated showing weakness to anyone, even this kind stranger who'd given him no reason to distrust. "That," Dr. Fletcher said gently, "is a question only you can answer, but whatever you decide, decide it quickly. Word travels fast in these small towns, and it won't be long before someone else figures out who you are and who she is. When that happens, things are going to get very complicated, very fast." The doctor turned and walked back toward town, leaving Jesse alone with his thoughts and his impossible choices. The sun climbed higher, beating down with that relentless desert heat that made thinking difficult and decisions seem both urgent and impossible. Jesse stood at that crossroads, figuratively and literally, knowing that whatever he chose in the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but Elizabeth's as well. And somewhere, deep in his gut where instinct lived and truth couldn't be denied, Jesse knew he'd already made his choice. He'd just been too stubborn to admit it yet. Jesse didn't return to Dr. Fletcher's office for the rest of that day. Instead, he found himself wandering through Copper Ridge, a ghost moving through the living, watching people go about their ordinary lives and wondering what it must be like to not carry the weight of past sins on your shoulders like a millstone. He ended up in the saloon as the sun began its afternoon descent, not because he particularly wanted a drink, though Lord knows he could use one, but because saloons were places where a man could sit and think without drawing too much attention. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a magnificent mustache and eyes that had seen too much, poured Jesse a whiskey without being asked, and then had the good sense to leave him alone. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, a cleansing burn that temporarily pushed away the complications and contradictions that had become his life. Jesse nursed the drink slowly, making it last, while his mind worked through the impossible mathematics of his situation. Judge Blackwood's daughter. Of all the people in the territories, of all the women he could have stumbled across dying in the desert, it had to be her. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. Jesse thought about his friend, Tommy Brennan, hanged in Fort Smith 5 years ago after Judge Blackwood's swift verdict. Tommy had been a good man, a little wild maybe, a little too quick with a gun, but fundamentally decent. He'd gotten mixed up with the wrong people, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Judge Blackwood had made an example of him. 30 minutes of trial, guilty verdict, sentenced to hang at dawn 3 days later. Jesse had been there, had watched from the crowd as they'd led Tommy up those gallows steps, had seen the fear in his friend's eyes even as Tommy tried to keep his head high, tried to die with dignity. The rope had been too long, the drop not calculated properly, and Tommy had strangled slowly instead of dying quick. It had taken 4 minutes for him to stop twitching, 4 minutes that Jesse had counted out in heartbeats, 4 minutes that still haunted his nightmares. That was Elizabeth's father, the man responsible for that mercy, for that professionalism, for that swift and efficient justice that valued law over life. And yet, Elizabeth wasn't her father. She'd made that clear, had run from him, had staged her own death to escape his control and his plans for her future. She'd suffered under his rigid sense of right and wrong just as surely as Tommy had, just as Jesse himself had in the years since he'd been forced outside the law. Did the sins of the father automatically transfer to the daughter? Did Elizabeth deserve to be punished for the choices Marcus Blackwood had made? Jesse knew the answer to that, had known it from the moment she'd told him who she was, even as his anger and hurt had made him storm out of that room. Elizabeth was her own person, had made her own choices, had shown her own character in 100 small ways since he'd found her in that desert. The question was, what was Jesse going to do about it? "You look like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders," a voice said beside him. And Jesse turned to find an old man had settled onto the stool next to his, a weathered cowboy with skin like tanned leather and eyes that sparkled with mischief despite his years. "Either that or you're trying to drink away some woman trouble. Usually one or the other with men who sit alone at bars looking like death warmed over." Jesse almost told him to mind his own business, to leave him alone with his thoughts and his whiskey. But something about the old man's friendly manner, about the genuine concern beneath the joking tone, made him pause. "Both, maybe," Jesse admitted, surprised to hear himself speaking. "Got myself tangled up in a situation that has no good answers, just bad ones and worse ones." The old man signaled the bartender for his own drink, a beer that arrived in a mug spotted with age. "Those are the only kind of situations worth talking about," he said. "The easy choices ain't choices at all. It's the hard ones that define a man, that separate the wheat from the chaff, if you'll pardon the biblical reference." "You a preacher?" Jesse asked. The old man laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside. "Lord, no. Used to be a Texas Ranger, back when that meant something. Back before politics and corruption turned the whole thing rotten. Name's Ben Carter, and I've probably seen more trouble in my 72 years than most men see in 3 lifetimes. Jesse," he said, offering his hand without thinking, then cursing himself for giving his real name to a stranger, even a seemingly friendly one. But Ben just shook his hand firmly and nodded. "Jesse McCade, I know, recognized you the moment you walked in. Seeing your face on enough wanted posters to know it in my sleep." Jesse's hand went instinctively to his gun, but Ben held up a calming hand. "Easy now, son. I ain't in the bounty hunting business anymore, and I sure as hell ain't interested in turning you in. Like I said, I'm retired. These days I just drink beer and offer unsolicited advice to young folks who look like they need it. And you think I need advice?" Jesse asked, still wary but relaxing slightly. "I think you need perspective," Ben said. "I think you're sitting here wrestling with a decision that seems impossible, and you can't see the forest for the trees. So let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honest, not what you think you should say, but what your gut tells you. This woman you're tangled up with, do you care about her?" The question hit Jesse like a punch to the sternum. Did he care about Elizabeth? He'd known her less than 24 hours, had spent most of that time either unconscious or recovering from near death. How could he care about someone he barely knew? But even as these objections rose in his mind, Jesse knew they were lies, knew that something had passed between him and Elizabeth out there in that desert, something that couldn't be measured in hours or explained by rational thought. "Yes," he admitted quietly. I don't understand it, don't even know if it makes sense, but yes. I care about what happens to her. Ben nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then there's your answer right there. Everything else, all the complications and the history and the reasons why you shouldn't, that's just noise. The question ain't whether caring about her is smart or safe or logical. The question is what you're going to do about it. Her father is Judge Marcus Blackwood, Jesse said, needing Ben to understand the full weight of the impossibility. The hanging judge. The man who sent more outlaws to their graves than frontier justice and lynch mobs combined. He hanged my best friend 5 years ago on evidence that wouldn't convict a dog of stealing table scraps. Ben was quiet for a long moment, his beer forgotten in his hand. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with an old sorrow. I knew Marcus Blackwood back in the day. Served with him during the war, fought side by side in battles that would make your hair turn white to hear about. He was a good man once, believed in right and wrong, in protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. But the war changed him, or maybe it just revealed what was always there underneath. He came back convinced that the world was a fight between absolute good and absolute evil, with no room for anything in between. That doesn't make what he's done any less terrible, Jesse said. No, Ben agreed. It doesn't, but it might help you understand that his daughter, she probably suffered under that absolutism just as much as you did, maybe more. Living with a man like that, having him as your father, that's a special kind of hell. No wonder she ran. Jesse took another drink of his whiskey, letting Ben's words sink in. The old ranger was right, of course. Elizabeth had been as much a victim of her father's rigid beliefs as Jesse had been. Perhaps more so because she'd had to live with them every day of her life. So what do I do? Jesse asked. I can't stay here forever. Eventually someone's going to recognize me, going to send word to the nearest marshal. And if her father finds out she's alive, he'll come for her. He'll drag her back to that marriage she was running from. He'll do what fathers do, Ben interrupted. He'll try to control her, try to make her choices for her, try to keep her safe in the only way he knows how, which is by keeping her locked in a cage of his own making. But here's the thing, Jesse, she's not asking you to fight her battles for her. She's not asking you to protect her from her father or from the world. She's just asking you not to abandon her, not to be another person who walks away when things get complicated. The truth of those words hit Jesse like a revelation. Ben was right. Elizabeth wasn't asking for a hero, wasn't asking to be rescued from her life. She'd been doing a fine job of rescuing herself before the raiders had intervened. All she wanted was someone who would see her for who she was, not who her father was, or who society expected her to be. I have a sister, Jesse heard himself saying. Sarah, she's dying in a sanitarium in Santa Fe, consumption eating away at her lungs. The money I have, the money from my last robbery, it's supposed to buy her treatment, buy her time. Every day I stay here is a day she doesn't get that money, doesn't get the help she needs. Ben's expression softened with understanding. And you're thinking it's a choice, her or Elizabeth, like you can only save one of them, isn't it? Jesse asked, and he hated the desperation in his voice, hated feeling this helpless in the face of impossible circumstances. Maybe, Ben said. Or maybe there's a third option you're not seeing yet. Life has a funny way of presenting solutions when we stop trying to force them, when we stop thinking we have to control everything and just let things unfold the way they're meant to. Before Jesse could respond, the saloon doors swung open with a crash that made everyone turn to look. A young man barely out of his teens stood in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like greed. Jesse McCade's in town. The kid shouted to everyone and no one. Jesse McCade, wanted for robbery and murder, worth $2,000 to whoever brings him in. I seen him with my own eyes, staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The saloon went silent, every eye turning to look at Jesse, calculating, considering, weighing the $2,000 against the risk of trying to take down a notorious outlaw. Jesse could see it happening. Could see the moment when greed overcame caution in several sets of eyes. Could see hands moving toward guns and men shifting positions to cut off the exits. "Well," Ben said calmly, taking another sip of his beer as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. "Looks like your thinking time just ran out, son." Jesse was already moving, his hand on his Colt, his body angling toward the back door he'd noted when he first entered the saloon. Old habits, old survival instincts kicking in with the practiced ease of a man who'd been in tight spots before and lived to tell about it. "Don't do anything stupid," Jesse called out to the room at large, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made men pause even when their greed was screaming at them to act. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I'm just going to walk out that back door, going to get my horse, and going to ride out of your town. You let me do that. Everyone lives to spend their money on whiskey and women. You try to stop me, people are going to die, and I promise you won't be collecting any bounty if you're bleeding out on this dirty floor." For a moment, Jesse thought they might listen, might let him walk away. But then a voice from the back, emboldened by drink or stupidity or that particular brand of frontier courage that got more men killed than cholera, shouted, "Get him!" What happened next was chaos, pure and violent and inevitable. Jesse drew his Colt with the speed of long practice, fired a shot that took the hat off the closest man reaching for his gun. A warning shot that bought him precious seconds. He was moving even as he fired, spinning toward the back door, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and distances, and the likelihood of making it to redemption before someone put a bullet in his back. Ben Carter, God bless the old ranger, threw his beer mug at the nearest would-be bounty hunter, caught him square in the face and sent him stumbling backward into 2 other men. "Go!" Ben shouted at Jesse. "I'll slow them down." Jesse didn't argue, didn't waste time with thanks or questions about why Ben would help an outlaw he barely knew. He just ran, bursting through the back door into the alley behind the saloon, his boots pounding on hard-packed earth as gunshots erupted behind him. The livery stable was 3 buildings down, and Jesse covered the distance in seconds that felt like hours, his heart hammering in his chest, adrenaline singing through his veins with that familiar combination of terror and exhilaration that came with running for your life. Redemption was in his stall, and the horse recognized the urgency in Jesse's movements, standing ready as Jesse threw on the saddle with practiced efficiency. More gunshots from the direction of the saloon, men's voices shouting, the whole town erupting into chaos and violence. Jesse swung up into the saddle, was about to spur redemption toward the open desert, toward freedom and safety and another day of running, when a thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. Elizabeth. He couldn't leave her. Not now, not with the town in an uproar, not with men who would have no qualms about taking out their frustration on the nearest available target. And once they realized who she was, once someone made the connection between Elizabeth Blackwood and Jesse McCade, she'd be in even more danger than he was. "Damn it," Jesse swore, even as he was already turning redemption back toward the main street, back toward Dr. Fletcher's office, back toward the woman who'd somehow become the center of his complicated world in less than a day. The ride through Copper Ridge was a nightmare of near misses and desperate maneuvering. Men were pouring out of buildings now, drawn by the commotion. Some carrying guns and some just curious, but all of them potential obstacles between Jesse and his destination. He fired his Colt twice more, warning shots aimed high, designed to scatter crowds rather than kill, though he knew his restraint might cost him everything. Dr. Fletcher's office appeared ahead, and Jesse practically threw himself off Redemption's back, hitting the ground running and bursting through the door with enough force to send it crashing against the wall. Dr. Fletcher stood in the front room, his medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other, his eyes wide with alarm. "McCade, what in God's name is happening out there?" "No time to explain," Jesse said, already moving toward the examination room. "Is she able to travel?" "Barely," Dr. Fletcher protested. "She's in no condition to be moved, especially not." "Doc," Jesse interrupted, his voice urgent but not unkind. In about 3 minutes, this office is going to be surrounded by every bounty hunter and desperate fool in Copper Ridge. They're going to tear this place apart looking for me. And if they find her, if they realize who she is, they'll use her against me or worse. So I'm asking you, can she travel?" Dr. Fletcher's face went pale as he processed Jesse's words, understood the danger they were all in. "I'll help you get her ready," he said simply, setting down the shotgun and moving toward the examination room. Elizabeth was sitting up in bed when they entered, her eyes wide with fear at the sounds of chaos filtering through the windows. "Jesse, what's happening?" "We need to go," Jesse said, already moving to her side. "Right now. Can you ride?" I don't know my arm. Can you ride?" Jesse repeated, more forcefully this time, and he saw her jaw set with that determination he was coming to recognize and admire. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I can ride." Getting her dressed in mobile was an exercise in controlled chaos. Dr. Fletcher helping her into a simple dress while Jesse kept watch at the window, seeing men gathering in the street, hearing the angry voices calling for his head, for his blood, for justice. "There's a side door," Dr. Fletcher said, supporting Elizabeth as she stood on shaky legs. "Leads to an alley that runs behind the buildings. If you're quick, you might make it to the edge of town before they realize you're gone." "Come with us," Jesse said impulsively, seeing the danger Dr. Fletcher was in simply for having helped them. "They'll take it out on you once we're gone." But Dr. Fletcher shook his head. "I'm an old man who's lived a full life. You two have years ahead of you yet, God willing. Besides, someone needs to stay and tell these fools they're being idiots, chasing a man who never hurt anyone except in self-defense, and defending a woman who doesn't deserve to be dragged back to a life she doesn't want." There was no time for further argument, no time for proper goodbyes or thanks. Jesse helped Elizabeth out the side door, supporting her weight as best he could while she leaned heavily on his arm, her face pale with pain but her eyes determined. Redemption was waiting where Jesse had left him, the loyal horse standing steady despite the chaos swirling around them. Getting Elizabeth into the saddle was difficult, her broken arm making mounting almost impossible, but she gritted her teeth and pulled herself up with her good arm, Jesse lifting and supporting her from below. Jesse swung up behind her, settling into position with Elizabeth cradled between his arms, and for one brief moment, he let himself acknowledge the feeling of rightness that came with holding her close, with protecting her, with choosing her despite all the logical reasons he shouldn't. "Hold on," he murmured in her ear. "This is going to be rough." Then he spurred Redemption forward, bursting out of the alley at a gallop, and the desert swallowed them whole. The desert at night was a different creature than it was during the day, transformed from a burning wasteland into something almost beautiful, bathed in silver moonlight that turned the landscape into a study in shadows and light. But Jesse had no time to appreciate the beauty, no attention to spare for anything beyond keeping Redemption moving and keeping Elizabeth from falling from the saddle as exhaustion and pain threatened to claim her consciousness. They'd been riding for 3 hours, heading northeast away from Copper Ridge, away from the posse that would surely form once the initial chaos subsided, away from everything familiar toward an uncertain future in the wilderness. Jesse kept changing direction, doubling back, covering their tracks as best he could in the darkness, using every trick he'd learned in his years of running to make their trail as difficult to follow as possible. Elizabeth had stopped asking questions after the first hour, had simply held on with her good arm wrapped around the saddle horn, her body swaying with Redemption's movement, trusting Jesse to keep them alive, to keep them free. He could feel her trembling against him, could hear the occasional whimper of pain she couldn't quite suppress when the horse's gait jostled her broken arm despite the splint. "We need to stop soon," Jesse finally said when the moon had risen to its zenith and Redemption's steps had begun to falter with exhaustion. "Find shelter, get some rest. We can't keep running like this. We'll kill the horse and ourselves." Elizabeth nodded weakly, past the point of argument, past the point where pride or stoicism could mask her suffering. "Anywhere," she managed. Just somewhere I can stop moving, even for a few hours. Jesse had been watching the landscape, looking for defensible positions, and he'd spotted what might work, a jumble of boulders perhaps half a mile ahead that would provide cover and concealment. He guided Redemption toward them, praying that his instincts were right, that this wouldn't turn out to be a trap or a dead end. The rocks, when they reached them, proved even better than he'd hoped. Ancient stone formations created a sort of natural cave, open to the sky but sheltered on three sides, with a clear view of the surrounding terrain and only one approach that could be easily defended. Best of all, there was a small seep of water trickling from the rocks, not much but enough to keep them and Redemption alive for a day or two if necessary. Jesse dismounted first, then carefully helped Elizabeth down, catching her when her legs threatened to give out beneath her. He guided her to a spot against the sheltered rock wall, helped her sit, and then immediately turned his attention to Redemption, unsaddling the exhausted horse and leading him to the water. "You did good, boy," Jesse murmured, running his hands over Redemption's sweat-darkened coat, checking for injuries or signs of distress. "Real good. Rest now. We'll need you again tomorrow, but for tonight, just rest." Once the horse was tended to, Jesse returned to Elizabeth, carrying his saddlebags and the few supplies he'd managed to grab before fleeing Copper Ridge. He had water, some jerky, a blanket that was more holes than fabric, and the dwindling bottle of laudanum from Dr. Fletcher's medical kit. "How's your arm?" he asked, settling beside her against the rock wall. "It hurts," Elizabeth admitted, her voice small and exhausted in the darkness. "Everything hurts, but I'll survive." "I've survived worse." Jesse wanted to ask what she meant by that, what kind of pain she'd experienced in her privileged life that could compare to a broken arm and a desperate flight through the desert. But this wasn't the time for such questions, wasn't the moment for unpacking the complexities of her past. Instead, he offered her the laudanum bottle. "Small dose," he cautioned. "Just enough to take the edge off. We might need this to last a while." She drank carefully, then handed the bottle back. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the desert night, the distant cry of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone, the vast emptiness that surrounded them like a blanket made of stars and darkness. "Why did you come back for me?" Elizabeth finally asked, her voice soft but clear. "In Copper Ridge, you could have escaped. Could have been miles away by now, safe from pursuit. Why did you risk everything to come back?" Jesse had been asking himself the same question, had been turning it over in his mind during the long ride, examining it from every angle, trying to understand his own motivations. "Because leaving you would have made me exactly the kind of man I've been trying not to be," he finally said. "Because I've lost too much already, given up too many pieces of myself to survival and necessity. I couldn't lose that too, couldn't lose the part of me that still gives a damn about other people, even when that person is the daughter of the man who hanged your best friend." Elizabeth asked, and Jesse heard the weight behind those words, heard her expecting him to say no, expecting him to finally admit that she was a burden, a complication he should never have taken on. "Especially then," Jesse said fiercely. "Because you're not responsible for your father's sins, Elizabeth. You're not guilty of his crimes any more than I'm guilty of my father's failed ranch or my mother's early death or any of the other things that happened before I had any choice in the matter. You're just you, and that's enough. That's more than enough." He felt her shift beside him, felt her good hand reach out and find his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that was both innocent and profound, a connection that went beyond words, beyond logic, beyond all the reasons they should remain separate and alone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for not just seeing Marcus Blackwood's daughter, but seeing Elizabeth, just Elizabeth." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, shoulders touching, two people who'd been running from different things, finding a moment of peace in each other's presence. Jesse couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this kind of connection with another human being. This sense that he wasn't entirely alone in the universe, that someone understood, really understood. what it meant to carry the weight of an unwanted past. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. Elizabeth's head drooped to rest on Jesse's shoulder, and he wrapped the threadbare blanket around them both, keeping watch even as his own eyes grew heavy, unwilling to let his guard down even for a moment when danger might be closing in from any direction. He must have dozed, because when he jerked awake, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that pre-dawn glow that transformed everything into shades of gray. And in the growing light, Jesse saw something that made his blood run cold. Riders, perhaps a dozen of them, spread out in a wide search pattern, moving methodically across the desert terrain, checking every gully, every rock formation, every place where fugitives might hide. They were still miles away, but they were heading in Jesse's direction, and at their current pace, they'd reach the rock formation by mid-morning. Jesse carefully extricated himself from Elizabeth's sleeping form, letting her rest a few minutes longer while he assessed the situation. He climbed to a higher vantage point, using the rocks for cover while he studied the approaching riders through narrowed eyes. They weren't amateurs, that much was clear. They moved with military precision, maintaining formation, covering each other's blind spots. The kind of professional manhunting that suggested someone with experience was leading them. And at the head of the formation, mounted on a gray stallion that was far too fine for any common bounty hunter, was a man whose posture and bearing spoke of authority and absolute confidence in his own righteousness. Even at this distance, even without being able to make out facial features, Jesse knew who it was. Judge Marcus Blackwood had come for his daughter. Jesse climbed back down to where Elizabeth still slept, his mind racing through possibilities, all of them bad. They couldn't outrun the posse, not with redemption exhausted and Elizabeth barely able to sit a saddle. They couldn't hide, the search pattern was too thorough, the riders too professional. They couldn't fight, not 12-1 with a wounded woman and limited ammunition. Which left only one option, one so terrible that Jesse's mind recoiled from it, even as he knew it was the only choice that made sense. He had to surrender. He had to give himself up, hope that Judge Blackwood's focus would be on his daughter rather than on immediate vengeance for past wrongs. Maybe, if Jesse turned himself in peacefully, if he explained that he'd saved Elizabeth's life, protected her, brought her back to her father, maybe the judge would show some small measure of mercy. It was a desperate hope, built on foundations as fragile as morning frost. But it was the only hope they had. "Elizabeth," Jesse said gently, kneeling beside her and softly touching her shoulder. "Elizabeth, you need to wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to alertness as she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "Your father's coming," Jesse said simply. "He's got a posse, maybe 12 riders, and they're going to find us within the hour. There's no way out, no way to run that doesn't end with us dead or captured." Elizabeth sat up, wincing at the pain in her arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something that might have been resignation. "You should go," she said. "Leave me here. Tell them you found me like this, that you were just passing through. They'll believe me if I say you didn't do anything wrong." Jesse shook his head. "They won't believe that, and even if they did, I'm not leaving you. We're past that now, Elizabeth. We're in this together, for better or worse. Then what do we do?" she asked, and Jesse heard the trust in her voice, the absolute faith that he would have an answer, that he would find a way out of this impossible situation. "We face him," Jesse said. "We go down there and we face your father, and we tell him the truth, all of it. What happened to you, how I found you, why I helped you. And then, well, then we hope that somewhere under that hanging judge exterior, there's still a father who loves his daughter enough to listen." It wasn't much of a plan. Hell, it barely qualified as a plan at all. But it was all they had, and as the sun rose higher and the riders drew closer, Jesse helped Elizabeth to her feet, made sure she was as presentable as possible given their circumstances, and prepared himself to face the reckoning he'd been running from for 5 long years. Judge Marcus Blackwood, the hanging judge, the man who'd killed Jesse's best friend, the man who represented everything Jesse hated about frontier justice. This was going to end badly. Jesse only hoped he could keep Elizabeth safe when it did. The confrontation happened in a box canyon half a mile from the rock formation, a place where Jesse had no advantage and nowhere to run. He'd chosen it deliberately, wanted the judge to see that this wasn't an ambush, wasn't a trap, that Jesse was coming to him willingly, surrendering on his own terms. Jesse rode redemption slowly, Elizabeth seated behind him, her good arm wrapped around his waist, her face pale but composed. Behind them, the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and terrible, and utterly indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath its merciless gaze. The posse saw them coming, and Jesse watched as they formed up, rifles raised, ready to cut him down at the first sign of aggression. But at the center of the formation, Judge Marcus Blackwood raised one hand, a command for restraint, for patience, for allowing this to play out rather than ending it in a storm of bullets and blood. As they drew closer, Jesse got his first clear look at the man who'd haunted his nightmares for 5 years. The judge was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and a beard that was more white than black. His face was weathered but strong, carved from granite, with eyes the same impossibly blue as his daughter's, but colder, harder, unforgiving. He wore a long black coat despite the heat, proper Eastern clothing that looked absurd in the desert, but somehow suited him, made him look like what he was, an avatar of law and order transplanted into the lawless frontier. His right hand rested on the butt of a revolver worn high on his hip, ready but not drawn. Violence held in check, but ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. Jesse brought redemption to a halt 20 feet from the judge, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid immediate capture. He raised both hands slowly, showing they were empty, showing he posed no immediate threat. "Judge Blackwood," Jesse said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I'm Jesse McCade, wanted for robbery in 6 territories. I'm here to turn myself in, but first I want you to listen to what I have to say. I want you to understand what happened to your daughter and why." The judge's eyes had locked onto Elizabeth the moment she'd come into view, and Jesse saw something crack in that granite facade, saw raw emotion flash across his features before discipline reasserted itself. "Elizabeth," the judge said, his voice rough with feelings he was struggling to contain. "My God, you're alive. We thought, the reports said you'd been killed by raiders. We thought." He couldn't finish, and Jesse was surprised to see tears gathering in the corner of those cold blue eyes, genuine grief and relief warring for dominance. "I'm alive, Father," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly in the desert silence. "No thanks to the men you had escort me to Sacramento, the men who were supposed to protect me but who tried to rob me instead. If it hadn't been for Jesse, I would have died out there in the desert. He saved my life." The judge's eyes snapped from his daughter to Jesse, and the warmth that had briefly appeared was gone, replaced by that familiar cold judgment. "You expect me to believe that Jesse McCade, wanted outlaw, saved my daughter out of the goodness of his heart? That there wasn't some ulterior motive, some scheme to use her for ransom or worse?" "Believe what you want," Jesse said, keeping his voice level despite the anger rising in his chest. "I found her dying beside an overturned wagon, broken arm, no water, no shelter, maybe hours from death. I could have ridden past, could have left her there to whatever fate the desert had in store. But I didn't. I brought her to Copper Ridge, got her to a doctor, made sure she was safe and cared for. And when the town figured out who I was, when bounty hunters started coming for me, I came BSCK for her instead of running. So yes, Judge Blackwood, I saved your daughter, and I didn't ask for anything in return except the satisfaction of doing one decent thing in a life full of mistakes." The silence that followed Jesse's words was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind across sand and the stamping of horses restless in the heat. The judge stared at Jesse with those penetrating eyes, seeming to look right through him, to examine every word for truth or lies, every motive for deception or genuine compassion. "Is this true, Elizabeth?" The judge finally asked, "Did this man save your life as he claims?" "Every word is true, Father," Elizabeth said. And Jesse felt her arm tighten around his waist, felt her drawing strength from his presence, just as he drew strength from hers. "Jesse McCade saved my life when he had every reason not to, when doing so put his own freedom and safety at risk. He's shown me more kindness and genuine care in 2 days than I've experienced in years of living under your roof, under your rules, under your absolute certainty that you know what's best for everyone." The judge flinched as if she'd struck him, and Jesse saw pain flash across his features, saw the cost of her words hitting home. "Elizabeth, I know you're angry about Cornelius, about the marriage arrangement, but you don't understand the pressures I was under, the debts, the obligations." "I understand perfectly," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice rising with passion and long-suppressed fury. "I understand that you were willing to sell me like cattle to settle your gambling debts, to preserve your precious reputation. I understand that you valued your standing in society more than my happiness, my freedom, my right to choose my own future. I understand that when I came to you and begged you not to make me marry Vanderberg, you told me that my feelings were irrelevant, that duty and family honor were all that mattered. I was trying to protect you." The judge shouted back, his own control finally breaking, his voice echoing across the desert. "Trying to secure your future, trying to make sure you'd be provided for after I'm gone. Everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been to keep you safe, to give you the life you deserve." "The life you think I deserve," Elizabeth shot back. "Not the life I want, not the life I choose for myself. You've spent so long judging others, so long deciding what's right and wrong for everyone else, that you forgot I'm not one of your defendants, Father. I'm your daughter, and I deserve to have a say in my own life." Jesse sat silent, feeling like an intruder in this family drama, witnessing the unraveling of years of resentment and hurt. But he also felt Elizabeth trembling against him, felt her using his presence as an anchor, as support for finally saying the thing she'd needed to say for so long. The judge looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes, the granite facade crumbling to reveal the vulnerable man beneath. "I lost your brother," he said quietly. "I sent him to prison because the law demanded it, because I believed that justice had to be blind, had to apply equally to everyone regardless of who they were or who they were related to. And he died there, died because I was too proud, too rigid to show mercy, to bend the rules even for my own son. Do you have any idea what that feels like, Elizabeth? Do you know what it's like to carry that burden, to know that your own principles killed your child?" The raw pain in his voice was almost unbearable, and Jesse felt his anger toward the judge soften despite himself. This was a man who'd been broken by his own convictions, who'd sacrificed everything he loved on the altar of his beliefs, and was only now beginning to understand the cost. "Then why?" Elizabeth asked, her own voice breaking with emotion. "Why would you do the same thing to me? Why would you try to control my life the same way you controlled Thomas's? Hadn't you learned? Hadn't you seen what happens when you value rules over people, when you put principle above compassion?" "Because I didn't know what else to do," the judge cried out. "Because letting you make your own choices, letting you run off into a world that I know is cruel and dangerous and unforgiving, that terrified me more than anything else. At least if you married Vanderberg, you'd be safe, you'd be provided for, I'd be miserable," Elizabeth finished. "I'd be trapped in a marriage with a man 3 times my age, bearing his children, managing his household, slowly dying inside while pretending to be the perfect wife he'd purchased. Is that really the life you wanted from me, Father? Is that the safety you were offering?" Judge Blackwood had no answer for that, and the silence that fell was heavy with the weight of truths that couldn't be taken back, of damage that couldn't be undone. Jesse watched the judge struggle with himself, saw the internal war playing out on his features. Principles versus love, law versus mercy, the rigid beliefs that had governed his life versus the messy reality of human emotion. Finally, the judge turned his attention back to Jesse, his eyes still hard, but something in them that might have been respect, or at least acknowledgement. "You saved my daughter's life," he said. "For that, I owe you a debt, regardless of what crimes you may have committed. But you're still a wanted man, Jesse McCade. You've robbed, you've fled from justice, and by your own admission, you've broken the law in 6 territories. What am I supposed to do about that?" This was the moment Jesse had been dreading, the moment when his fate would be decided by the man who'd shown no mercy to Tommy Brennan, who'd built his reputation on swift and unforgiving justice. Jesse met the judge's eyes steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to show the fear that churned in his gut. "I don't expect mercy," Jesse said quietly. "I know what I've done, and I know the price that's supposed to be paid for those crimes. But before you pass judgment, before you decide what happens to me, I want you to know, each why I did it. I want you to understand that I didn't rob that Western Union office in Silver Creek because I'm some kind of heartless criminal. I did it because my sister, Sarah, is dying in a sanitarium in Santa Fe. She has consumption, and the doctors require payment for every treatment, every day she spends in their care. The money I stole was going to buy her time, maybe another 6 months, maybe less, but time, Judge. Time with my sister before the disease takes her from me the way it's taken everything else. Many criminals have sympathetic stories," the judge said. But his voice lacked the conviction Jesse would have expected, lacked that absolute certainty. The law cannot bend simply because someone has a good reason for breaking it. If we allowed that, there would be no justice, only chaos. Then what's the point of the law? Jesse challenged, feeling Elizabeth's hand squeeze his waist, silently encouraging him. If the law can't distinguish between a man who robs to save his sister and a man who robs for greed or cruelty, if the law treats them exactly the same, then the law isn't about justice at all. It's just about power, about control, about making sure everyone stays in their place, regardless of circumstance or compassion. The judge opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. And Jesse saw something profound happening behind those blue eyes. Saw the man beginning to question beliefs he'd held for decades. Saw the cracks forming in the foundation of his worldview. "Father," Elizabeth said softly, "I'm asking you, I'm begging you, to show mercy. Not for me, not because you owe Jesse for saving my life, but because it's the right thing to do. Because sometimes being a good man is more important than being a good judge. Because if you send Jesse to hang for trying to save his sister, then you're no better than the cruelty you claim to be fighting against." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea in equal measure. Jesse watched the judge struggle with himself, watched as years of rigid belief warred with the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about the nature of justice, about the purpose of law, about the difference between punishment and cruelty. Minutes passed in tense silence, each second feeling like an eternity. The posse sat on their horses, watching, waiting, ready to act on whatever decision their leader made. Jesse felt redemption shift beneath him, felt Elizabeth's warm presence at his back, felt the desert sun beating down on all of them with its impartial heat. Finally, Judge Marcus Blackwood spoke, and when he did, his voice was different, softer, carrying a weight of consideration that Jesse would never have expected from the hanging judge. "I'm going to do something I've never done before," the judge said slowly, as if each word was being carefully weighed before being released. "Something that goes against every principle I've built my career on, every belief I've held about the law and its purpose. Jesse McCade, I'm going to let you go." Shock rippled through the posse, through Elizabeth, through Jesse himself. He couldn't have heard that right. Couldn't have just heard the hanging judge offering freedom instead of a noose. "But," the judge continued, raising his hand to forestall questions, "there are conditions. You will return every dollar you stole from that Western Union office. You will travel to Santa Fe and use my money, my connections, to pay for your sister's continued care. And you will stay away from criminal activity, will live a clean life, will give up this outlaw existence and try to become the man I think you have the potential to be. Father," Elizabeth started. But the judge wasn't finished. "And Elizabeth," he said, turning to his daughter with an expression that held more vulnerability than Jesse would have thought possible from such a man. "I was wrong. Wrong to try to force you into a marriage you didn't want. Wrong to value my reputation over your happiness. Wrong to believe that controlling your life was the same as protecting it. If you want to return home, you're welcome, and there will be no more talk of Van der Berk or arranged marriages or any of that foolishness. But if you choose to go your own way, to build your own life separate from mine, I'll accept that too. I'll accept it because I finally understand that loving you means letting you make your own choices, even when those choices terrify me." Tears were streaming down Elizabeth's face now, and Jesse felt his own eyes burning with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. This wasn't how this was supposed to end. The hanging judge was supposed to be merciless, was supposed to send Jesse to the gallows without hesitation. But instead, he was showing compassion, showing understanding, showing the capacity for growth and change that Jesse had thought impossible in a man so set in his ways. "Why?" Jesse finally managed to ask, his voice rough. "Why are you doing this?" Judge Blackwood looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because my daughter is right. Because I've spent so long judging others that I forgot to judge myself, forgot to question whether my principles were actually serving justice or just serving my own need for certainty in an uncertain world. Because you saved her when you didn't have to, protected her when it put you at risk, and that kind of character deserves recognition, deserves a second chance. And because," his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "because maybe if I show you the mercy I didn't show my own son, maybe that begins to balance the scales. Maybe that starts to make amends for all the times I chose law over love." Jesse didn't know what to say, couldn't find words adequate to express the gratitude and relief and sheer disbelief coursing through him. He'd expected to die today, expected to be dragged back to Fort Smith in chains, expected to see Sarah one last time from behind bars before the rope claimed him. Instead, he was being given a gift he'd never dared hope for, freedom, and more than that, the money and means to save Sarah, to finally do the one thing that mattered more than anything else. "Thank you," Jesse said, and the words felt inadequate but were all he had. "Judge Blackwood, I thank you. I'll honor your conditions. I'll live up to the second chance you're giving me. I swear it." The judge nodded once, then turned his horse away, his voice carrying back over his shoulder. "See that you do, Mr. McCade, see that you do. Elizabeth, whatever you decide about your future, know that I love you, and that my door will always be open to you." Then he was riding away, the posse following, leaving Jesse and Elizabeth alone in the desert with redemption and the rising sun and a future that had suddenly, impossibly, become possible again. The journey to Santa Fe took 8 days, traveling at a pace that accommodated Elizabeth's injuries and Redemption's need for rest after their desperate flight from Copper Ridge. They moved through the desert and then into mountain foothills, the landscape transforming around them, reflecting the transformation taking place within themselves. Jesse used some of Judge Blackwood's money the judge had pressed into his hands before riding away, to purchase proper supplies in a small town called Junction Creek, new clothes for Elizabeth, actual women's clothes instead of the torn dress she'd been wearing, food that went beyond jerky and hardtack, medicine for her arm, which Dr. Fletcher had carefully instructed Jesse on how to administer, a proper tent for shelter at night instead of sleeping under stars, or in whatever cave or overhang they could find. They traveled as husband and wife, using false names, James and Catherine Reynolds, 2 settlers heading west to start a new life. It was easier than explaining the truth, safer than letting anyone know who they really were. And somewhere along the trail, the pretense began to feel less like a lie and more like a possibility, a future they might actually be able to claim if they were brave enough to reach for it. Jesse found himself watching Elizabeth when she wasn't aware, studying the way sunlight caught in her hair, the way her face transformed when she smiled, the quiet strength she displayed as she recovered from her injuries. She no longer seemed like Judge Blackwood's daughter or the helpless woman he'd saved in the desert. She was becoming simply Elizabeth, a woman with her own dreams and desires, her own vision of what her life could be. And Elizabeth, for her part, watched Jesse with equal fascination, seeing past the notorious outlaw to the man beneath, the man who checked on her comfort before his own, who told her stories around the campfire about his childhood before the war, before the violence, before everything had gone wrong. She saw his gentleness with redemption, the way he moved through the world with careful awareness, the intelligence behind his eyes that belied his rough exterior. They talked for hours as they traveled, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden from the world. Jesse told her about Sarah, about growing up on the ranch, about his father's dreams and their violent destruction. Elizabeth told him about growing up in a house where love was secondary to propriety, where every action was judged against an impossible standard of perfection, where she'd learned to hide her true self beneath layers of acceptable behavior. "What will you do?" Jesse asked her one evening as they sat by their campfire, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "After we reach Santa Fe, after I get Sarah settled, what will you do with your freedom?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions she was still forming. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "For so long, I've been defined by what I was running from rather than what I was running to. My father, Vanderberg, the life I didn't want, those were real and concrete. But what I actually do want, what kind of life I want to build, that's still unclear to me." "You could go back," Jesse suggested. Though the thought of her leaving created an ache in his chest, he didn't want to examine too closely. "Your father made it clear you'd be welcome, and from what I saw, he meant it. He's trying to change, trying to be better. Maybe there's a future for you there." "Maybe," Elizabeth agreed. "But I don't think that's my future. I think I need to discover who I am separate from him, separate from his expectations and his reputation. I need to know that the choices I make are mine, not just reactions to his choices." "That's wise," Jesse said, admiring her clarity even as she claimed uncertainty. "What about you?" Elizabeth asked, turning to look at him across the fire. "After Sarah is settled, after you've fulfilled your promise to Judge Blackwood, what will Jesse McCade do with his second chance?" It was a question Jesse had been asking himself, a question that kept him awake during his watch shifts, staring at the stars and wondering what came next. "I honestly don't know," he said. "For years, my life has been defined by running, by surviving, by staying one step ahead of the law and the consequences of my choices. The idea of just living, of having a normal life with normal concerns, that's foreign to me. I don't even know if I'd be any good at it." "I think you'd be better at it than you believe," Elizabeth said softly. "I've watched you these past days, Jesse. I've seen how you interact with people when you're not playing the role of the dangerous outlaw. You're kind, you're thoughtful, you're intelligent. Those qualities don't just disappear because you're not running anymore. They're part of who you are, who you've always been underneath the circumstances." Her words touched something deep inside Jesse, some part of himself he'd thought lost forever. "You give me too much credit," he said, uncomfortable with the praise but grateful for it nonetheless. "I don't think I do," Elizabeth replied. "I think you don't give yourself enough credit, and you've spent so long believing the worst about yourself that you can't see the good that's always been there." The conversation lingered between them after they'd said goodnight, after Elizabeth had retired to the tent and Jesse had taken first watch. Her words echoed in his mind, challenging assumptions he'd held for years, suggesting possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. What if she was right? What if there was more to Jesse McCade than the outlaw, the criminal, the man wanted in 6 territories? What if the second chance Judge Blackwood had given him could actually lead somewhere, could actually become something meaningful instead of just a postponement of inevitable justice? The miles to Santa felt both too long and too short, each day bringing them closer to a destination that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Jesse found himself increasingly reluctant to think about what came after. About the moment when he'd have to say goodbye to Elizabeth, when she'd ride off toward her unknown future, and he'd be left alone again with only redemption and his memories. Because somewhere during those 8 days, somewhere between Junction Creek and the mountain passes they'd traversed, Jesse had realized something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He'd fallen in love with Elizabeth Blackwood. It was foolish, dangerous, completely impractical. They'd known each other barely 2 weeks, most of that time spent in desperate circumstances, or recovery from desperate circumstances. They came from different worlds, had different backgrounds, had every reason to remain separate once this adventure concluded. But none of that mattered to his heart, which had apparently made its own decision without consulting his brain about the wisdom or logic of such feelings. He didn't tell her, couldn't tell her, didn't know how to form words around something so profound and terrifying. Instead, he showed her in small ways, making sure she had the best portions of food, checking on her comfort every few hours, teaching her to ride properly once her arm had healed enough to hold reins, sharing his coat when mountain nights grew cold. And if Elizabeth noticed the change in him, if she sensed the depth of feeling behind these gestures, she gave no sign, maintaining the friendly companionship they'd established, treating him with warmth and affection, but nothing that suggested she felt anything deeper than gratitude and friendship. Which was fine, Jesse told himself. Which was appropriate given their circumstances. Which was better than hoping for something that could never be. Santa Fe appeared on the horizon on the afternoon of the 8th day, a sprawling collection of adobe buildings and narrow streets, colorful and vibrant and alive with the sounds of commerce and humanity. Jesse felt his chest tighten as they approached, knowing that somewhere in those streets was Sarah, dying slowly, waiting for a brother who might be too late. "We should find the sanitarium first," Elizabeth said, as if reading his thoughts. "Get your sister settled, make sure she has everything she needs. Everything else can wait." Jesse nodded gratefully, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. They rode into Santa Fe as the sun began its descent, 2 dusty travelers on a tired horse, unremarkable among the dozens of other people moving through the streets. The sanitarium was on the eastern edge of town, a large building painted white with green shutters and gardens that seemed almost obscenely beautiful given the suffering housed within its walls. Jesse dismounted slowly, helping Elizabeth down, then stood staring at the building as if it might bite him. "Do you want me to wait here?" Elizabeth asked gently. Jesse shook his head. "No, come with me. I need." He couldn't finish, couldn't articulate the need for her presence, for her strength lending itself to his own. But Elizabeth understood anyway, taking his hand in hers and squeezing gently. "Then let's go see your sister." The interior of the sanitarium was cool and quiet, with that peculiar smell that all medical facilities seemed to share, a mixture of carbolic acid and sickness, and something that might have been despair. A nurse at the front desk looked up as they entered, her expression professionally pleasant but tired, as if she'd seen too much suffering and learned to armor herself against it. "We're here to see Sarah McCade," Jesse said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. The nurse's expression shifted, became wary. "Are you family?" "I'm her brother," Jesse said. "Jesse McCade. I've been away, but I'm here now. And I have money for her treatment, for whatever she needs." Something in the nurse's face made Jesse's blood run cold, made his heart start hammering against his ribs with terrible premonition. "Mr. McCade," she said gently, standing and coming around the desk. "I'm so sorry. Your sister, she passed away 3 days ago. Her lungs gave out suddenly. There was nothing we could do. I'm so sorry." The words hit Jesse like bullets, each one finding its mark, tearing through him with more force than lead and powder ever could. 3 days. He'd been 3 days too late. While he'd been traveling with Elizabeth, while he'd been discovering feelings and possibilities and hope for the future, Sarah had been dying alone, without family, without anyone who loved her there to hold her hand or tell her it would be okay. He was aware of the sound tearing from his throat, something between a sob and a scream, aware of his knees giving out, aware of Elizabeth catching him, supporting him, her arms around him as he crumbled under the weight of grief, too massive to comprehend. "No," he heard himself saying, over and over, like a prayer or a curse. "No, no, nitrogen monoxide. I was supposed to save her. I was supposed to be here. I was supposed to." But there were no words for this loss, no language adequate to express the hollowness opening up inside him where hope had lived just moments before. Sarah was gone, had died alone and afraid, and Jesse hadn't been there, hadn't fulfilled the one promise that had kept him going through years of running and surviving and desperate criminality. He'd failed her completely and absolutely. And no amount of second chances or redemption or new beginnings could ever change that terrible, irrevocable truth. Time moved strangely after the nurse's revelation, minutes and hours blending together in a haze of grief that made everything seem distant and unreal. Jesse went through the motions of arranging Sarah's burial, of paying the sanitarium for her care up until her death, of collecting her few possessions, a worn Bible, a photograph of their parents, a letter she'd written to him that he couldn't bring himself to read yet. Elizabeth stayed close throughout it all, her presence a quiet anchor keeping him tethered to reality when everything in him wanted to simply drift away into the numbness. She handled the practical details when he couldn't, spoke to officials when he couldn't find words, made decisions when his mind refused to function beyond the constant loop of guilt and regret. They buried Sarah on a hillside overlooking Santa Fe, a simple grave with a simple marker that said only her name and the dates that bracketed her too short life. Jesse stood over the fresh earth, hat in hand, tears streaming down his face that he made no effort to hide or control, while a priest read words from Scripture that were meant to provide comfort, but only seemed to highlight the unfairness of a world that would take someone so young, so innocent, so undeserving of suffering. "I'm sorry," Jesse whispered to the grave when the priest had finished and left them alone. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I really tried, but I wasn't fast enough, wasn't good enough, wasn't there when you needed me. I'm sorry." Elizabeth's hand found his, squeezing gently, offering comfort without platitudes, without trying to tell him it would be okay or that Sarah was in a better place. She simply stood with him, sharing his grief, her presence saying what words could not. "You are not alone in this. You do not have to carry this burden by yourself." They stood there until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that seemed too beautiful for a day marked by such loss. Finally, Jesse took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and turned away from the grave, away from his sister, away from the life he'd fought so hard to save and failed to preserve. "What now?" Elizabeth asked softly as they walked back toward the hitching post where redemption waited patiently. "I don't know," Jesse admitted, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in days. "Everything I've done for the past 5 years, every choice I made, every risk I took, it was all for Sarah, to keep her alive, to buy her time, to give her a chance. And now she's gone, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this second chance I've been given. Don't know what it's for anymore." They mounted redemption, Elizabeth settling in front of Jesse this time, leaning back against his chest in a gesture of comfort and intimacy that he was too drained to question. They rode into Santa Fe as darkness fell, finding a hotel that asked no questions and accepted Judge Blackwood's money without comment. That night, for the first time since learning of Sarah's death, Jesse opened the letter his sister had written. Elizabeth sat beside him on the edge of the hotel bed, close enough that he could feel her warmth, far enough to give him space for his grief. With shaking hands, Jesse unfolded the paper and began to read Sarah's familiar handwriting, seeing her in every loop and curve of the letters. "My dearest Jesse, if you're reading this, then I've finally lost my battle with this terrible disease, and you've come too late to say goodbye in person. I want you to know that I don't blame you for not being here at the end. I understand why you've done the things you've done, why you've lived outside the law, why you've taken such desperate risks. You did it for me. To give me hope, to give me time, and I am more grateful for that than words can express. But Jesse, I need you to listen to me now. Perhaps the last time I'll ever get to tell you anything. You have to stop running. You have to stop sacrificing yourself on the altar of my illness. Stop making choices you'll regret for the rest of your life just to buy me a few more months. I don't want that. I've never wanted that. What I want, what I've always wanted, is for you to live. Really live, not just survive. Find something worth living for beyond guilt and obligation. Find someone to share your life with, someone who sees the good man I've always known you to be. Build something lasting, something meaningful, something that honors the memory of who we both were before the world broke us. You've spent so long trying to save me, dear brother. Now it's time to save yourself. I love you. I've always loved you. And wherever I am now, whatever comes after this life, I'll be watching over you, hoping you find the happiness and peace you deserve. Your loving sister, Sarah. Jesse's vision blurred with tears as he read the last lines, as Sarah's words penetrated the armor of guilt and regret he'd been carrying. She hadn't wanted him to sacrifice himself. She'd wanted him to live, to find joy, to build a future beyond the desperate scramble for money and time. He'd been so focused on saving her that he'd never stopped to ask what she actually wanted from him. She sounds like she was an amazing person, Elizabeth said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. She was, Jesse managed. She was everything good that I'm not. Everything pure and kind that got lost in me when the world turned hard. And she wanted me to. He couldn't finish, overcome by the weight of his sister's final gift, her permission to stop punishing himself, her blessing to seek happiness despite all his failures and mistakes. Elizabeth turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers, her blue eyes intense and filled with something Jesse was afraid to name. Jesse, she said, and there was a certainty in her voice that cut through his grief like sunlight through storm clouds. Your sister was right. You've spent so long running, so long defining yourself by what you've lost and what you've done wrong, that you can't see what you've found, what you've done right. I haven't done anything right, Jesse protested. I couldn't save her, couldn't get the money to her in time, couldn't. You saved me, Elizabeth interrupted fiercely. When you could have ridden past, when helping me put everything you cared about at risk, you stopped anyway. You brought me to safety, protected me from bounty hunters, came back for me when any sane man would have run. You showed my father that mercy was possible, that change was possible, that the rigid black and white world he'd built was just one option among many. Jesse, you've changed everything, for me, for my father, for yourself. That's not nothing. That's everything. Jesse stared at her, seeing the conviction in her eyes, the absolute belief in him that he'd never been able to summon for himself. Elizabeth, I love you, she said, the words simple and earth-shaking in their directness. I've loved you since that moment in the desert when you could have left me but didn't. Since that night in Copper Ridge when you came back instead of running. Since every moment we've spent together learning each other's stories and discovering who we could be together. I love you, Jesse McCade, and I hope that you might love me too. The confession hung in the air between them, terrifying and beautiful and utterly honest. Jesse felt something break open inside him, some last barrier of fear and unworthiness crumbling under the weight of her words, her courage, her willingness to risk rejection in pursuit of truth. I do, he said, his voice rough but steady. God help me, Elizabeth. I love you more than I thought I could love anything after losing so much. You're everything I didn't know I needed. Everything I thought I'd never deserve. But I'm broken. I'm an outlaw with a past I can never fully escape. I'm a man who couldn't even save his own sister. Elizabeth pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. You're a man who chose compassion over convenience, she said. You're a man who kept his word even when it cost him everything. You're a man who's been given a second chance and has the courage to actually take it. That's who you are, Jesse. Not the mistakes, not the failures, not the things you couldn't control. That's who you are. And then she was kissing him, and Jesse was kissing her back. And for the first time since learning of Sarah's death, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jesse felt something other than grief and guilt and crushing weight. He felt hope. 6 months later, in a small house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, Jesse McCade stood in his modest garden, tending to vegetables that were finally starting to thrive after weeks of careful attention. The work was honest, simple, satisfying in ways that running and stealing and surviving had never been. He'd used Judge Blackwood's money, not for criminality, but for opportunity, had purchased this land, had built this life with his own 2 hands. Elizabeth, now Elizabeth McCade in Truth and Law, came out of the house carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, her smile as bright as the summer sun. "You're going to burn if you're not careful," she teased, handing him a glass. "Worth it," Jesse said, pulling her close with his free arm, kissing her forehead. "This garden, this life, it's all worth whatever small discomforts come with it." They'd been married for 4 months, in a small ceremony attended by Dr. Fletcher from Copper Ridge, by Ben Carter, the retired ranger, and by Judge Blackwood himself, who'd stood beside Jesse as his unlikely best man, and had told anyone who would listen that he'd never seen his daughter happier. The judge visited regularly now, trying to rebuild the relationship with his daughter, trying to become the father she'd needed all along. It wasn't always easy. Years of hurt and distance didn't heal overnight, but they were trying, which was more than either had thought possible 6 months ago. Jesse had kept his promise to Judge Blackwood, had lived clean, had stayed away from criminal activity, had become a productive member of society. He'd even helped the local sheriff track down a gang of real outlaws who'd been terrorizing the territory, his knowledge of criminal thinking proving useful on the side of law for once. And he'd found something he'd never expected: peace. Not the absence of pain or regret. He still visited Sarah's grave every week, still carried the weight of being too late. But he'd learned what his sister had tried to tell him in her letter, that peace wasn't about erasing the past, it was about choosing to live in the present, about building something good from the ashes of what had been lost. "I got a letter from Copper Ridge today," Elizabeth said, settling into the chair beside him on their small porch. "Mrs. Patterson writes that Dr. Fletcher is finally retiring. Says he's talking about spending his remaining years fishing and avoiding medical emergencies. She asked if we'd consider coming back for a celebration in his honor. Would you want to go?" Jesse asked. "Back to where it all started?" Elizabeth considered this, her hand finding his and intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I think so," she finally said. "I think it would be good to return to that place, not as fugitives or people in crisis, but as who we've become. To show them that the story that started so desperately actually had a happy ending. Not an ending," Jesse corrected gently. "A beginning. All of this, you and me, the life we're building, it's not the end of some story. It's the start of something new, something we get to write together." Elizabeth smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder, watching the sun set over their garden, over their home, over the future they'd fought so hard to claim. "A beginning, then," she agreed. The beginning of Jesse and Elizabeth McCade, former outlaw and runaway daughter. Now just 2 people trying to build something good in a world that's not always kind to second chances, but sometimes is, Jesse added, thinking of Judge Blackwood's mercy, of Dr. Fletcher's compassion, of Ben Carter's wisdom, of all the people who'd chosen to see the best in him when he couldn't see it in himself. "But sometimes is," Elizabeth echoed, and in her voice, Jesse heard the same gratitude, the same wonder at the strange paths that had brought them together, the same determination to make their second chance count for something. The desert wind whispered through the evening air, carrying the scent of growing things and distant rain. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, the man Jesse had been still existed, still ran from his past and his mistakes. But here, in this moment, in this life he'd built with Elizabeth, Jesse was finally learning to stand still, to be present, to accept that redemption wasn't about erasing what had been done wrong, but about choosing to do right going forward. He'd saved Elizabeth from certain death in that desert, never knowing her true identity, never suspecting that rescuing her would ultimately save him too. And in the end, that was the real miracle, not that an outlaw had saved a judge's daughter, but that through compassion and courage and the willingness to see past labels and past sins, two broken people had found each other and discovered that together they could be whole. The story that had begun with a question, what would you do if you saved someone only to discover they were not who they seemed, had found its answer in the only place such answers could truly be found, in the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of two people choosing each other despite every reason they shouldn't, building a life on the foundation of second chances and the transformative power of love. Behind them, the house waited, warm and welcoming, filled with the promise of dinner and conversation and the quiet intimacy of shared lives. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own opportunities for grace or failure. But tonight, Jesse and Elizabeth McCade sat together on their porch, hands joined, hearts at peace, living proof that even in the harsh and unforgiving frontier, even when the odds seemed impossible and hope seemed foolish, sometimes the outlaw got to ride off into the sunset. Sometimes, miraculously, he got to take the woman he loved with him. And sometimes, most precious of all, they both got to discover that home wasn't a place you found. It was a choice you made, together, every single day.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.